it wasn't until, obviously, as I mentioned before, we do our rankings separately, and then I put them in a Google sheet for John to make the graphics. And ironically enough, tight end wise, we have the exact same rankings. So this way, this will be fun because we can just kind of talk through it together. But I'll let you announce 5. You can do the odds. I'll do evens if that's easier or whatever. But you can definitely do the first one. At number 5, who do we have for the 5th best tight end heading into 2023?
Yeah, number 5, we have Kyle Pitts. It was tough, right? Because Kyle Pitts had a pretty poor year. He only has 300 yards. But at the same time, if people are blaming Pitts for the year, I don't trust that they've actually watched any film of the Falcons whatsoever, and I don't think that they've looked at any stats whatsoever outside of the total yards. Kyle Pitts led the NFL in total throw, his throw percentage passes targeted towards him that were uncatchable. It was crazy high. I can't remember what the exact number was, so I'm not going to try and wager a guess, but I know that he led the NFL, and that's obviously a Mariota issue. Also, the scheme was having a lot of plays that were very easily could have put him in situations where he's the main target, but they're using him this is self-admittedly by Arthur Smith as a decoy a lot of the time, which is just absurd. So I blame a lot on the scheme, the quarterback. I hope things get better. And I really just don't think that his talent has declined whatsoever, considering that this guy is literally the second tight end ever to have 1,000 yards as a rookie, the first since Mike frickin' Ditka. Mike Ditka was the coach of the 85 Bears. So this stat that Ditka did it was in the 70s. So, yeah. Anyway, maybe even the 60s. I don't actually remember when Ditka's rookie year was. I think it was the 70s, but I could be wrong. Anyway, point being, Kyle Pitts, historical generational talent. If he had an actual quarterback throwing in the ball, I mean, look, even and we talked about Matt Ryan earlier when we were talking about the running back with Jonathan Taylor and everything, and Ryan didn't have a great year. Matt Ryan with Kyle Pitts was they got 1,000 yards. So imagine Kyle Pitts in an actual offense with a really solid quarterback. We could see this guy putting up literally record-breaking numbers for the tight end position. So yeah, talent-wise, we had to put him in there. Sadly, production-wise and usage-wise, he wasn't quite in there last year, which is why we only had him at number 5. So who do we have at number 4?
Yeah, number 4, we got Dallas Goedert. He's just been really solid, I felt, for the Eagles, really good. I mean, kudos to them. And I remember you would probably remember that draft. They got him. They jumped over Dallas to get him. And they had Zach Ertz at the time, too. And remember, they let go of Zach Ertz a couple of years ago. And obviously, they don't do that without feeling good about Dallas Goedert. Good blocker, but I think is very underrated in terms of pass catcher. And unfortunately, there's just a lot of cooks in that kitchen right now. And A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, and obviously Jalen Hurts running the ball himself, too. So it takes away from him, but I think he's really good short to intermediate route guy. Obviously, he's no Kyle Pitts or some of these other guys where they can not only be a deep threat, but are amazing with the ball in their hands. I would say that's maybe a weakness of Goddard. He isn't the most shifty tight end, but like I've said before, you can't have it all. Really darn good to be at number 4. And yeah, that's why I had him at 4. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I believe he was the highest graded run blocking tight end in the NFL last year too. So really dominant run blocker as well, which I mean, some people might not value, but I think for certain schemes is very valuable, especially talking about the Eagles and how effectively they run the ball. He was clearly a pretty massive part in that.
Yeah, I want to add on that too. For those that aren't valuing, once again, you can only have 11 players on the field, and when one of those guys, you don't really know if as a defender, you don't know if he's just going to stay in and block, and then you commit to that. Oh, all of a sudden he's run past me because I thought it was a run play, and I'm committed to filling in the gap that Goddard's trying to open, and then he ran past me. So yeah, there's a lot of value in it. People in tight end that can do multiple things, but yeah, Goddard, one of those guys. So he's number 4 for both of us. Who do we have at 3, John?
At number 3, and this is maybe a little bit surprising for some people, we have Mark Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens. The only reason I say it's surprising is obviously because his kind of recent ascent and also The people who are maybe a little bit more familiar with fantasy football have, talked about him, is it's like him and Travis Kelce at the top. But yeah, we have Mark Andrews at number 3. Obviously a really great tight end. I do think that in terms of like not only the receiving talent and the actual production that we've seen on the field, I feel like there's kind of a jump between the Goedert, the Pitts, and all the other guys. Like with tight ends, I feel like there's kind of like we talked about the running back, there's tiers. I feel like with the top 3, they're kind of in their own tier. Then there's a tier below, which is Goedert, Pitts, maybe like one other guy that we didn't talk about. And then, then you could drop down even further with the tier 3. But Mark Andrews is obviously a really elite tight end. He's the number 1 option on his team, which is, kind of why I separate him from a Goedert and Pitts. He is like the primary receiving option. Truly a dominant tight end. Unfortunately, with the injuries to Lamar Jackson over the years, hasn't necessarily had quite the same production when Tyler Huntley has been in there. It's a little easier for defenses to scheme for Andrews when Huntley's behind center. Also, Andrews kind of dealt with some injuries, unfortunately, as well last season, so didn't have quite the same dominant era that he did before, but still an amazing tight end in his own right. Also, notably, over the last couple of years, he has really stopped run blocking almost altogether. This is something that when you get really nerdy with fantasy football, you can look into like tight ends run blocking percentage and like of total snaps they play. And he is one of the lowest at this point, which I do think is a little interesting because of how heavily they run the ball and can make them seem a little bit more readable, I guess, like you just talked about with Dallas Goedert, and how like that he can be on the field at all times. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a weakness from Andrews, but I do think it's something certainly notable that I think, for me at least, kind of kept him out of that top 2 range as of right now. But like I said, in his own right, he is still certainly a really amazing tight end who deserves to be in that top 3. And I don't know if you had any other thoughts on him.
No, you really hit the nail on the head in that one. Like you said, the main target for the Baltimore Ravens, and still produces consistently. So it'll be very interesting along with this new offense to see if they can utilize him more, or just it'll be easier for him to get open now that the receivers are actually threats on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, we good to go to number 2?
Yep.
All right, at number 2, we have Mr. George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. Just mentioned versatility, and run blocking, and also being a receiving threat. I think Kittle is that personified. I know Goedert, you said, was graded as the highest run blocker. I still would take Kittle. I think Kittle's a better run blocker. They ask him to do a lot in terms of run game. He is very key in that Kyle Shanahan running game. And then obviously very key in the passing game, as we've all seen. One of those guys that can beat you intermediate, deep, short, and also great after the catch too, in terms of not as shifty as probably the guy we have at number 1, but is pretty darn shifty regardless, and can run through tackles because of his size and physicality. And we all know George Kittle brings the attitude and physicality pretty much every game and every second. So he's at number 2. Is there anything you want to add before you go to number 1?
I'll just say that this is my first year, I think maybe ever, at least since we've done the podcast, that I have not had George Kittle at number 1. Which I thought was somewhat notable to bring up, because I've always been a huge George Kittle guy, and moving him to number 2 I don't think is necessarily a shot by any means, but yeah, I don't know. I think that we'll talk about it when we get to number 1, but yeah, this is my first year not having Kittle at number 2, or sorry, at number 1, having him at number 2. But at number 1 we have Travis Kelce, which is no surprise to people. The reason to me that I swapped the 2 is that Tyreek Hill leaves. Kelce has now become like the obvious go-to target. They don't even necessarily have like a real true deep threat on that Chiefs roster. I mean, like, yeah, they still had some speedy receivers, but Marquez Valdes-Scantling as your best deep threat isn't really something that like a lot of teams are fearing, like it was with Tyreek Hill. And so it was just a lot easier to cover over the middle. And yet Travis Kelce still has a career season. Not necessarily in terms of efficiency, but a career high in total yards. He beats out his previous high in 2018 by 2 yards. Now, he did have a whole extra game to do it, but still a career high in yards, a career high in receptions at 110 and career high in touchdowns at 12. And that's just kind of crazy to me that after all these years, I mean, he's what, 32 now, 33, somewhere around there. He's getting older, and yet he has that dominant of a season, despite the fact that defenses can now easily key in on him. I don't think that any defense out there was going into the Chiefs week and being like, man, we really gotta like throw some double teams at Scantling and Juju Smith-Schuster and Sky Moore and all these kind of other guys. No, it was, what can we do to stop Kelce? And in the past, there was always also the worry of Tyreek Hill. And without that in the defenders' minds, I think it was going to be an easier year to defend against the Chiefs. And yet, like I said, Kelce goes out there and he has a pretty dominant season. So it was impossible for me not to put him at number one. Also, I mean, they win the Super Bowl. He goes to the Pro Bowl, all-pro team starting tight end. He's all these kind of things. He was, I think, 6th in Offensive Player of the Year voting. Like, just an amazing season from Travis Kelce that, I had to put him at number one.
Yeah, I agree. I got not much else to add. Like I've already alluded to, like, if not one of the shiftiest tight ends ever, at least the shiftiest tight end in this game right now. I mean, in terms of just getting open, shaking guys free. Obviously, the chemistry he has with Mahomes helps in that, doing things off script or on the fly. And then on top of that, with the ball in his hands, he is still very dynamic in terms of making people miss or just straight outrunning people, and has enough power and physicality to run some of the smaller guys over. Just even if you put a corner on him, he can still use his size to win often, more times than not. So, yeah, like you already alluded to, he's best tight end, one of the best weapons in the game. I too was expecting the start of the decline, I would say, in my mind, of Kelce last year, and obviously that did not happen. So, yeah, I also had him at one as well as you this year. But to review our top 5 from last year, maybe gain some perspective. Last year I had Kelce 1, Kittle 2, Andrews 3, but I had Waller at 4, Goedert at 5. And then last year you had Kittle 1, as you mentioned, Kelce 2, Mark Andrews at 3, Kyle Pitts at 4, and Darren Waller at 5. Real quick, and I'll throw it to you afterwards. I don't have Waller in the top 5. Health is obviously a huge issue for Waller. Part of the reason, he's been dealing with them the past couple of years. I think I mentioned it last year too. I was like, man, like hopefully he can stay healthy, or else he's kind of on the fringes. And we'll see how he does with the Giants, but that's why he didn't make my top 5. What about you?
Yeah, health was an issue. I mean, he's now reached his age 30 season. I think a big differentiator for Waller has always been his speed, and he's still certainly like a prime athlete, but I think that, I don't know, just I haven't been as impressed with him the last 2 seasons, which once again, he's missed games due to health, as I was the 2 years before that. It doesn't seem as threatening to defenses, despite the fact that, you add in some other weapons around him over the years too. So I don't know. I do think that he's actually poised for a really big season with the Giants, assuming that he can be healthy. But yeah, I think that the other 5 have just kind of surpassed him to me, which I already had 4 of those already on there above him. It's just I moved Goedert into my top 5 now.
Yeah, and the only one I kind of want to talk about was Hawkinson. I think Hawkinson was in consideration for me, but it's just more of like, okay, like we finally saw him in a more passing offense. We saw a little bit of his capabilities. Like he would have been probably 6 for me, honestly, if we keep going down the list. And then Waller probably at 7, but he's one that could sneak in with just a little more to go off of, because unfortunately Detroit was kind of sucky the first couple of years, didn't really utilize him, and then last year gets traded to the Vikings, and we see a little bit of him growing into a bigger role. But what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Hawkinson had a really strong year. I certainly considered him for that same spot as well. But I don't know. I also, like you said, I think that although he did have a career year, I think it was in large part due to just getting more opportunities. I mean, you think like he had 900 yards, right, which is really impressive. And he was actually incredibly efficient with it in Detroit. getting 400 yards despite only 26 receptions. Like he was averaging 15 yards a reception. And then he goes to Minnesota, he gets 500 yards, but it's like half the yards per reception, which isn't necessarily a big issue. But I think that his total yards number was a little bit more inflated just due to pure opportunity, to where like when I'm comparing him, say, to Kyle Pitts, for example, who did not have the same yardage total season. Kyle Pitts was just way more efficient with the options that he did have. He's got a way worse situation around him. I think Kyle Pitts is more talented. And so I'm like, man, if you swap the roles there and you put Kyle Pitts in that offense, like he's going to put up pretty game-breaking numbers more than Hawkinson would. So that situation kind of just came down to simply talent for me personally.
Yeah, and that's a good perspective to add because, but all right. So we very rare. Who knows if it'll ever happen again, where we have a consensus positional ranking. I'm just gonna look right now. I don't think we do, right? I know you're the ones.
I don't think any other lists. No.
Yeah, but, so yeah, that's pretty. If you got some reason you have a podcast Uno card or bingo card, I guess you could fill out that one. But nonetheless, that is the tight end rankings for 2023 for both of us. Had a consensus top 5. And just going to go over that one more time. Pitts at 5, Dallas Goedert at 4, Mark Andrews at 3, George Kittle at 2, and Travis Kelce at 1 for both of us. So you can feel free to disagree in the comments or wherever you're listening, because we will be posting this on our YouTube as well if you're watching there. But that'll do it for John and I for this one, for the NFC West and top 5 running backs, top 5 tight ends. As always, you can feel free to rate, review if you're listening on our audio podcast mediums, and then YouTube, rate, like, comment, subscribe. And then, we have our Instagram, @ChupandBallPod. I guess it's our Twitter is @ChupandBall, but I guess it's being transitioned to X now, right?
Yeah.
So
we don't really use it that much, though.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I don't really use it, so mainly focus on. We have a Facebook page as well, I guess, if you want to. If that's matters more your thing. But we'll be back next week to start talking. Let's see, we got NFC East and wide receivers next episode, so feel free to tune in for that one. And then obviously we're doing AFC, and like I said, we're doing all the teams. So if your team hasn't come yet, they will come. I will just let you know the Souths. AFC, NFC South, those are the last. So if you're waiting for that, you may be waiting a while. But for John and myself, that'll do it. We will see you all next time. Adios.